Before we begin today's episode, I want to encourage you to subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. I regularly write articles there that address issues of theology, Israeli politics, the war in Gaza, and much more. Among the articles published there in the past month are my proposed interview with Bibi, another article that addresses Israel's attempted elimination of Hamas leadership in Qatar entitled The Cop and the Prostitute, 2 articles about things I have learned during my 4 months of being a grandfather, a printable PDF of the laws of blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and more. So sign up for your free subscription today, and please share it with friends who will enjoy it too. Just log into Substack and look for Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. The link is in the description of this podcast.
Charlie Kirk was the only person that I was aware of who actually could save much of that generation, of his generation, from going the way of Candace Owens. And I can't see who's on the horizon to replace him. So the reaction to his brutal murder had to be one of not only gratitude and sympathy, but great concern about what we can do with the evangelical world to prevent the debacle.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Charlie Kirk's assassination was a shocking, tragic act of violence. Murder is a desecration of the image of God. Full stop. It should be condemned unequivocally. That doesn't change the fact that Charlie Kirk was a complicated public figure. He was outspokenly pro-Israel and often advocated for Jewish safety. He also, however, voiced criticisms of Israel. He advanced positions that many in the Orthodox world consider essential, but others consider deeply problematic. He defended Israel vigorously, and he also gave a platform to voices widely regarded as openly antisemitic. All of this is true, and ignoring any part of that picture does the Orthodox community no favors. In the days since Charlie Kirk's death, we've seen Orthodox individuals and organizations release statements ranging from restrained condolences to sweeping praise that some would call over the top. Today we're going to step back and ask, dispassionately and honestly, what should Charlie Kirk's legacy be for Orthodox Jews? This is not a eulogy, nor is it an indictment. Our aim is to slow the rush to hot takes and consider how a mature Orthodox community should remember someone who meant very different things to different people. We want to model steadiness, compassion for the bereaved, gratitude where it's due, and honesty about concerns without exaggeration or erasure. I have 3 guests today, Rabbi Yitzchak Adlerstein, Rabbi Pesach Walicki, and Rabbi Benjamin Kelsen. 2 of them are largely appreciative of Kirk's record, and 1 is less so. Together we'll explore where they agree, where they diverge, and what that means for real life, how institutions and leaders speak publicly, how we engage without fueling division, and how we keep our disagreements from corroding relationships. Above all, we'll try to conduct this conversation in a way that is truthful, proportionate, and humane, so that it can provide real guidance as we move into an uncertain future. And we'll get to that conversation in just a moment. First, I'm excited to announce that we at Jewish Coffee House are continuing to expand the conversation by bringing you, our listeners, into the mix, introducing JCH Q&A, an exciting new podcast where listener-submitted questions are answered in a thoughtful, honest, and engaging way. We plan to dive deep into your pressing hashkafic, political, and philosophical questions. We're looking to address the ideas that matter, the issues that challenge us, and the topics that spark real curiosity. Nothing is off limits, and all submissions will remain anonymous. To submit a question for our first episode, you must be a member of the JCH Podcast WhatsApp community. To join, look for the link in the description of this podcast. We look forward to receiving your questions. Remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Yitzchak Adlerstein is the Director of Global Faith Engagement for Israel 365. While living in Los Angeles, he directed interfaith affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center and taught Jewish law at Loyola Law School. He runs the Cross Currents blog, co-hosts the Two Rabbis, Three Opinions podcast, and has published books on the Maharal and the Nesiva Shalom. Rabbi Benjamin G. Kelsen is an Orthodox rabbi and practicing attorney. Rabbi Kelsen attended Cardozo School of Law and received ordination Yora Yora and Yadin Yadin from Yeshiva University's Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. Rabbi Kelsen is involved with various Jewish communal projects and advocates on behalf of the community and Israel with federal and state governments. His articles have appeared in the Times of Israel and other blogs and publications. Rabbi Pesach Wolicki is a political commentator, podcaster, and a leading voice in the field of Jewish-Christian relations. His columns appear regularly in the Jerusalem Post and Israel365news.com. His writings have also appeared in Newsweek, the Times of Israel, and many other publications. He appears on many Christian and politically conservative shows, such as American Family Radio's Middle East Report, Securing America with Frank Gaffney, The Josh Hammer Show, and others. He has been a frequent guest on Steve Bannon's War Room, even co-hosting an episode with Bannon. Rabbi Yitzchak Adlerstein, Rabbi Benjamin Kelsen, and Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, thank you all for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast. I'd like to start off talking about the recent Charlie Kirk assassination. It is somewhat in the past at this point. Nonetheless, the ramifications remain extreme and important. I'd like to ask each one of you to tell me, in your opinion, and this will set the framework for our conversation, what should the Orthodox Jewish response to his assassination be? I'm speaking on any level that you feel is appropriate, morally, halachically, or publicly. Pesach Wolicki, can we start with you?
Oh, I was hoping to go last, but okay, we can start with me. So I've made my views pretty much well known. I wrote a column in the Jerusalem Post that appeared this past Friday on the topic. I was a personal friend of Charlie's, especially in the last few months before he was murdered. I was in almost daily contact with him, and in my opinion, so I'm somewhat informed by that and maybe biased by that. Maybe I'm not seeing this situation as clearly as I would if I was not friends with him. I'm just being honest about that. But Charlie was he was a complicated person when it came to Israel, much more complicated than people are giving him credit for. And I say that to people on both sides of the current knife fight going on for what he actually believed about Israel. Charlie was neither a 100% flag-waving Christian Zionist, nor was he abandoning Israel in any way. But when you ask the question the way you asked it, what should the Orthodox Jewish community's reaction have been? Look, Charlie was someone who defended biblical values, who defended Western values. In my opinion, what makes America a great society is the Christian foundations of America. And Charlie was someone whose primary agenda for everything that he did and everything that he said in all of his campus visits was to bring America back to a place of being more rooted in biblical values. And I think as Orthodox Jews, that's something that we should applaud. One thing that I think one idea that I think should distinguish Orthodox Jews from non-Orthodox Jews in terms of hashkafa, or when I say Orthodox Jews, I mean Orthodox American Jews, is that Orthodox Jews should be more comfortable with the idea that we are guests temporarily in a Christian nation, because Orthodox Jews should embrace more the idea that we don't belong in the Galus anyway, and we're supposed to be in Israel, and therefore wherever we are, we're there temporarily, and shouldn't have such a problem with America being a Christian country. Whereas non-Orthodox Jews tend to find that to be more of a threat and tend to fight it more. So I think that the Orthodox Jewish community should have seen Charlie as generally a shining light and someone who's defending the values that we agree with, but at the same time, understanding that his position in the America First movement and his platforming of some problematic voices was something that we're not comfortable with, but doesn't necessarily make him puzzle. That's my attitude. And there's a lot more to say. We'll get into it.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Rabbi Kelson, what's your take?
I think that, as Rabbi Willeke had mentioned, I think that he was a very strong advocate for Israel. And I think that during this Tekufa, during these very challenging times, especially over the last 2 years, we cannot take that for granted. And I think that we have to definitely show a certain amount of hakaras hatov for that. I had no relationship with him, in contrast to Rabbi Willeke. Truth be told, I didn't even know who he was until afterwards, unfortunately. My kids had known a little bit about him. I am concerned by the level of glorification that we've been seeing in the United States. And again, I'm here in the United States, and I think that one of the things that we were seeing was almost a whitewashing sort of those complicating factors that Wilkie was referring to. And while I do agree wholeheartedly that we are in Gullus, and I think that that's part of what has made, and you and I have discussed in other times, that's part of what has made the situation that we're in right now so difficult. But I think that a lot of the positions that he took publicly regarding various topics are things that were problematic, whether that be on racial issues, on immigration issues, on things that are part of the political and social views, whatever we want to call them, from where he was coming from, his political and his socio-religious point of view, that were not necessarily in line with Torah values. I agree that family vows are important. I agree that Torah values are obviously incredibly important, but I don't believe that we should be glorifying and almost deifying somebody in that regard. So I think, in short, we should be having a tremendous amount of hakaras hatov for standing up at a time when, especially in the Christian right, the evangelical world, we are seeing a pushback against support of Israel. And so a tremendous amount of hakaras hatov for having the courage to stand up publicly and support Israel. I agree with Rabbi Willeke. I don't believe that he was turning his back on Israel in that regard. But I also think that we have to take into account that not everything that was being said aligns with what we have. And so we say thank you. And I think from there, we have to also acknowledge that there should be absolutely no place for political violence within civilized society, and that should go, both directions, and something that we have to really keep in mind.
Okay, thank you. Rabbi Adlerstein?
I think I'm more of a fan of Rabbi Willeke's response to the assassination than he is himself. And I'll explain why. I think I'm the only member of this panel who actually lives in Israel. Rabbi Willeke lives in RBS, Ramat Beit Shemesh, which was reputed to be the closest place in America to Israel. But I actually live in Yerushalayim, and I'm going to react as an Israeli pragmatist with an eye on what role Charlie Kirk served. At the same time, I'm a huge admirer of what Rabbi Kelson does and has been doing and will continue to do to remind the Orthodox community that exaggerated senses of some of the issues that many, if not most, of the Orthodox world signs on to are not necessarily aligned with real Torah values, especially as you see them expressed by the Nevi'im. And I admire him for being courageous and creating a space for those people who kind of sense that and don't like some of the views held by people like me and many others in the Orthodox community that would tend to be off-putting to them. And he's creating a space where they can function as Torah Jews, and that's just so important. So here's the role I see that Charlie Kirk played. He can't be understood except in the context of where MAGA Republicans are, where the evangelical community is, where the current generation of evangelical young people are, and how important he was. He was like the kid in the Netherlands with his thumb in the dike. We've been used to seeing evangelicals as the last authentic ally of ourselves, not only in the United States, but really throughout the world. Even when you deal with pathetic little moral midget like Carney in Ireland, and the whole country being kind of pathetic in virtue signaling when they really just don't matter on the world stage. But most of us abhor Ireland, especially some of us who used to get beaten up by Irish Catholics when we were kids living in a mixed neighborhood. But even in Ireland, you're going to find staunch advocates of Israel. They don't make the headlines, but they're all evangelicals. Problem is that they're aging evangelicals. The literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of evangelicals who were rah-rah for Israel are diminishing because the next generation, by now the second generation, is just not into the same values as their parents and grandparents. Those people were into Scripture, were wed to Scripture, and were not so much into theology or politics. They just said, if the Bible says we're supposed to befriend the Jews, then let's do it. The current generation is not like that, and they are being wooed by a number of forces. First of all, they grew up in liberal academic institutions. Even the church institutions have gone far to the left, and there's no room for Israel in their thinking. And then you have some of the extremes in the MAGA Republicans who are into a very hateful form of Christian nationalism that says, well, the Jews talk about this Judeo-Christian legacy, but do we really need Jews in it? And they're getting egged on by people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, and with a great success. Charlie Kirk was the only person that I was aware of who actually could save much of that generation, of his generation, from going the way of Candace Owens. And I can't see who's on the horizon to replace him. So the reaction to his brutal murder had to be one of not only gratitude and sympathy, but great concern about what we can do with the evangelical world to prevent the debacle.
Well, then, Rabbi Adlerstein, I guess I'll also address this to Rabbi Wielicki. I think you both are working in that same space right now. Is the younger generation of evangelicals simply less engaged regarding Israel, or cares less? Or have they also imbibed some of the larger anti-Israel rhetoric that academic institutions are presenting? In other words, is it a matter of simply getting them turned on to Israel, or do we have to actually combat a negative narrative where they're thinking bad things about Jews and about Israel? What do you think?
I'll give my answer because it'll be shorter. Both, plus the fact that what held on to evangelical support in the past was an examination of Scripture. They were able to push away supersessionism, which is now being given to them in huge dollops, that we don't need Jews because we've replaced the Jews. The last generations didn't care as much about that or didn't believe it because they were scripturally engaged. And this generation, largely because of, these little devices, is not engaged with Scripture.
I'll just build on what Rabbi Adlerstein said, that it's not a binary of, are they being more influenced by general culture and social media and secular universities versus their parents who were less influenced by those things. It has a lot to do with the popular theology today. And just to go a little further with what Rabbi Adlerstein was saying, within the Christian world today, you have a lot of young people who, although, as Rabbi Adlerstein said, they're not scripturally literate, meaning they don't actually read the Bible. They don't have a system of like Parshat HaShavua that we have, which takes you through certain basics in a repetitive way, that there's no such thing as an engaged Jew who doesn't know who Hagar was, for example, or, a dozen other examples of just certain basic stories. But you have Christians who literally have never read massive swaths of the Bible, and they're devout Christians. They will not miss church on Sunday. They are devoutly Christian. They're simply not reading the Bible, and instead they're placing a primacy on this, on whatever theological teachings they're being given. And the popular theology among young Christians today, which is, without getting into the weeds of Christian theology, it's, right now Reformed theology is making it's more than a comeback. It's really become the fad. And while that's not overtly anti-Semitic, it's built on a supersessionist foundation. And that's really what's being taught in the seminaries. So if you put that together with a lot of the stuff in media about Israel, the younger generation of Christians has disdain for their parents' Christian Zionism. They see it as kind of hokey and overly eschatological, and that not being a Christian Zionist is actually more purely Christian. That's kind of the fad right now. So that gets mixed in with a lot of political stuff that's going on to create a kind of negative trend in terms of Israel.
Rabbi Kelson, before when you mentioned the complicating factors in Charlie Kirk's legacy, to which Rabbi Wielicki referred as well, we're talking about somebody who was by and large very pro-Israel, but there were other positions that he held that people, you suggest, in the Orthodox world should not be so comfortable with. You mentioned immigration, for example. Could you give some examples of some of the areas where people who have been lionizing Charlie Kirk may not agree with everything that he actually said, in your opinion?
Sure. I mean, without going through quotations and citing them, which webcasts and things like that, I think that there was a lot of demonizing of immigrants since he was brutally murdered. I've done a little bit of reading and listening to him, not so much to newspaper articles, but to the actual recordings. Obviously, being in the field that he was, there's a lot of actual recordings of him. But he was a big proponent of the replacement theory, the idea that there is a movement, a plan, an actual, something concrete to replace white Americans with other people from other places in white jobs, whatever that means, and especially when we're talking about immigration. And in my role as an attorney, I also deal a lot with immigration issues and asylum cases. And just what I see is frightening, to the extent that I think I mentioned this to Rabbi Adlerstein when he and I spoke last week. If the policies that were in place today had been in place 80 years ago, I don't know that the four of us would be able to be sitting today speaking. I know that my grandfather, who came from Germany 3 months before Kristallnacht, would not have been able to survive, because he came in on a tourist visa because he couldn't get a regular visa, and then he overstayed. And so if the same policies that had been in place 80 years ago, I'm not sure that he would have been able to survive. And that, that goes for many, many, many of the Jews that did survive or were able to escape the Holocaust, even considering the fact that the immigration rules back then were horrible. And we have the case of the St. Louis, et cetera, et cetera. But we're getting off topic. I think a lot of the references that he made towards African Americans were not in line with the notions that we have been, that Torah teaches, that all people are created b'tselem Elokim, and that while we may have differences between us, at the core we are all created b'tselem Elokim, and therefore there should be no basis for racism within our society. And so therefore I think that a lot of his comments about affirmative action, a lot of his comments about, without getting into the particulars, but a lot of those comments were very difficult. I think that the way that he approached the LGBTQ issue was difficult, was very challenging. In other words, obviously halacha and Torah do not accept alternative lifestyles, as they are called, right? It's usher midaraisa. It's not something which can be permitted. However, we also have an approach, though, that we do not treat the person as being abhorrent. The act itself may be called a toeva, something which is abhorrent, an abomination in the act itself, but the person themselves we don't treat in such a fashion. And so I think that a lot of the way in which he referred publicly to people who were facing such challenges was definitely problematic. I think that the way that he spoke about people who are transgender facing that challenge without getting into any discussion as to what exactly is the root of all that. Those are things that were problematic, and it seemed to follow along with this right-wing MAGA Christian nationalist approach of how we deal with those who are on the other side of things. And when we talk about political violence, there was a lot of political violence that unfortunately has occurred, which is abhorrent, should never be permitted within civilized society. But when things were occurring on the other side, either he or others on the right did not find to be as problematic. When former Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked, the comments that Charlie Kirk made about that were not particularly appropriate or dignified. In June, when there was an attack in Minnesota against Democratic legislators, the comments that were made were not productive. And again, without going into direct quotes, those types of approaches, while they may ring true or may find great support within certain elements of the MAGA community, are not things that I believe that Torah observant Jews should be looking at and saying, wow, that's an amazing statement. Let's cheer that on. And so I think that those are things that we should be keeping in mind when Rabbanim are getting up and giving drashos about what happened.
I definitely appreciate something, and not only from what you're saying now, Rabbi Kelsen, I know Rabbi Willicke has said the same thing. I've heard him say it, that this reductionist attitude of pretending everything that Charlie Kirk said, when I heard one particular rabbi on Fox News call him today's Avraham Avinu, Abraham, and this kind of simplistic notion of taking the good and the bad and calling it all one wonderful human being who is wonderful and filled with Torah values, I think is not necessarily a healthy thing. That's certainly what you're saying. And I will add that I saw Rabbi Willicke's face as you were speaking. I certainly recognize that face from many years of friendship and working together. So, Rabbi Willicke, why don't you respond to that?
Sure. I know that Rabbi Kelsen said he doesn't want to bring up specific quotes, but I've listened to hundreds and hundreds of hours of Charlie, and I knew him personally. I can't ever remember anything that he said that was racist about Black people. And I didn't know that the affirmative action policies that have been around in America is a Torah value. I think that, there's legitimate criticism of where affirmative action has gone and how it's actually negatively impacted the Black community. And Charlie was someone who was willing to talk about those issues. And he never put anything on race. He never criticized any race racially, never talked about white jobs. I don't even recognize the person you're talking about here. And his issue with immigrants was only with illegal immigrants and with people who break the law to enter the United States. I mean, you talk about asylum seekers in World War II versus the supposed asylum seekers today who I'm not a lawyer, you are, but when asylum seekers pass through other countries that are not places of persecution or war, they're supposed to stop in that country. And most of the quote unquote millions of asylum seekers entering America were not actually asylum seekers from war-torn zones. That's what, Charlie, like many people in the MAGA movement, were calling out the mass millions and millions of illegal immigrants who were coming in and taking American jobs. And that, I think that's a legitimate I think that's a very legitimate issue, and to chalk it up as racism doesn't actually, it shuts it down as just kind of, oh, you're a racist, and it doesn't actually address the legitimate concerns that younger Americans have about the economic situation. And one of the drivers of real wages not rising over the course of the last few decades is the massive influx of illegal immigrants in the United States. And that's what Charlie called out. There was nothing racial about that. And also in terms of LGBT, there's so many videos of him interacting with LGBT people and the statements he put out, welcoming them into Turning Point and into the MAGA movement. And I know many prominent gay people in the MAGA movement who were also close friends with Charlie. And he's always very respectful with his interlocutors who are trans, who are gay on those campuses. He stood by his Christian values and he shared what he shared, but he was never disparaging of them in any way. So, I mean, the person you're describing sounds to me like a caricature from left-wing media and not the actual Charlie Kirk. That said, again, I had some problems with some of the positions he took, but they had nothing to do with the positions that you're raising here. Again, you're not bringing specific quotes, and you said you weren't going to, so it's kind of hard to to dispute innuendo. But I just don't. I just categorically disagree with the picture that you're painting of some of these issues of his.
Yeah, so I mean, first off, just to talk about immigration. So I think that a lot of the immigration stuff that is being discussed, and again, we're not here to discuss immigration. The way that immigration has been painted by many on the right is just not in touch with reality. When we talk about people passing through other countries, and you're talking about people passing through, let us say which is the most common, which is going through South and Central America, going through Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, up through Mexico, those are not countries where they're able to stop and start asking. And I can tell you from personal knowledge, and having sat with many, many, many immigrants on their way through, the vast majority of the people that are doing this are being herded through by cartels, that they are paying money to be able to escape something. A huge number, and I don't have the number off the top of my head right now, it's somewhere in the 80s, are all fleeing from something. They are coming to the United States to get away from something, whether it's drug cartels that are taking over their countries, whether it is in places like places in Africa, places in other continents, other areas where they are being persecuted, and they are coming. That's a problem. And that is actually seeking asylum. There are not millions and millions of people who are coming who are trying to fake their way in to the United States because they don't really need it, but they have this idea that they're coming to steal white jobs. And that's a farce which is being promulgated by those on the right, which is just very unfortunate. The concept that anybody who breaks the law, very, very few people who are trying to come from countries that or come to the United States for help or to escape are able to come on a legal method, because when you try to go, and especially during this administration and the previous Trump administration, when you try to go to a embassy or consulate to ask for a visa to be able to come, it takes forever to get that visa, and you're probably not going to be able to get it either quickly or that easily. And so therefore, anybody who comes across anybody who wants trying to get in is by definition, including many, many, many of our grandparents or great-grandparents or whoever they were, who came in by visitors' visas, to coming in ostensibly to visit for a period of 3 to 6 months, who had no intentions whatsoever of going back to Europe from where they fled. That's number one. Number two, regarding the issue of race, and I specifically didn't want to start making quotes because I wasn't trying to get into a debate on this issue, but some of the things, and they'll stand for themselves. I think that when you refer to people like Martin Luther King Jr. in certain fashion, or you divert attention from police brutality to the victim and focus on, their past in certain ways, that those are things that could talk about that do seem to go more towards race than towards other things. Again, I'm not based on, as I said earlier, it's not based on reading left-wing media. It's based on listening to the actual clips themselves. But again, putting that aside, he was a friend of Israel, or at least a supporter of Israel. I don't pretend to be as knowledgeable as Rabbi Adlerstein on the issue of where exactly evangelical Christianity holds the place of Jews and Israel in their theology, as far as what's the ultimate point or goal in supporting of Jews in Israel. But to the extent that he was supportive of Israel during this particular challenging time, so I think he does deserve thanks for that. But past that, I'm sure from what I've heard, he was a loving father and a loving husband, and he should get credit for that. I'm just not so sure about how much further we want to go past that as far as putting him on a pedestal.
Okay, let me move on to some other topics because I want to make sure we cover what we want to cover today. And I'd like to move forward with Rabbi Adlerstein because you mentioned before that he is or was the main person who had access to those young evangelical minds and who could convince them of the importance of Israel. And that is gone right now. In terms of the larger topic I'd like to talk about, in terms of Orthodox reactions, that still doesn't necessarily answer whether Orthodox organizations should be what might be called obsequious in their praise of Charlie Kirk because of his pro-Israel stance. I'm wondering how you feel about what the response has been. In other words, it's not just a matter of, yes, he was very important for Israel. It's also a matter of how do we react as a result of that? Do we want to end up being, for lack of a better term, sycophantic? And you might not say that we've been doing that, and maybe we haven't, but I believe that some people have been. So what's your feeling about that particular issue?
Well, none of us like words like sycophantic, but we have not arrived at that point. But at the same time, we've got to be pragmatic. The leadership of Turning Point USA is now turned to Erica Kirk. We know much less about her. I think we can have greater misgivings about her susceptibility to the material coming from the far right. So a little bit of being obsequious, unfortunately, was always part of Gullus, and in this regard, we're still very much in Gullus, even those living here in Eretz Yisrael. If you're living in times of war, you take aid from Richard Nixon, even when you knew, and we know better today than we did back then, that he's an anti-Semite. But he hated communism more than he hated Jews, so that made him do the right things. It's the same thing with Donald Trump. Many people believe that the pedestal we put him on should have its limitations, but it should be full-throated. I think if we have any chance of trying to make headway with the Turning Point USA clientele, we have to be somewhat obsequious. We have to artificially not only show gratitude, which is not artificial, but even supporting his legacy. At the same time, I mean, we have to keep in mind that what's happened to his legacy requires some pushback. I think the single phrase that jarred me the most in some of the reaction coming from the left was that Charlie Kirk was accused of being a Christo-fascist. Christo-fascist. I find this sort of sad and amusing at the same time, that after 2,000 years of the church priding itself on being the beacon of love, if they had to pick one word in the lexicon to describe what Christianity was, it was love. And now they're being told that, well, expressing some of the hesitations that Rabbi Wielicki did makes you a fascist. And the fascism comes from the fact that you are a Christian. When you have that kind of environment, you kind of have to give some credit to the or at least understanding to the context of what created Charlie Kirk and his following, the decades almost of the views of those miserable flyovers in Hillary Clinton's famous description, with all of these feelings of what's been happening to America, getting suppressed and getting mocked. You can kind of understand why there was a push in the other direction. And as usual, the task of Torah Jews is to try to find a balance between some of the extremes. So while I tend to identify more with Rabbi Wielicki's response, it still has to be said that, without getting into the weeds of what he and Rabbi Kelsen were arguing about, I find that largely immaterial. Rabbi Kelsen is still right that even though Rabbi Wielicki can say that, fighting affirmative action is not a sign of racism, there is a heck of a lot of racism in our community, and it doesn't belong there. That there is this disparaging of all immigrants because of the very, very deep concerns we have for the criminal elements, and not enough concern for those people, yes, who sneaked in and have been living as responsible members of their community, contributing members of the community for the last 20 years. That's not a Torah value. Take a look at the Rishonim on Lo Saskir Eved El Adonov. It's not an exact parallel, but the idea behind it that people who are behind the eight ball are not just thrown to the winds, but you try to make some accommodation if they are upstanding citizens and willing to buy into the contemporary culture. That's part of the job for Torah Jews to be doing, to find a delicate balance between them. But the bottom line is the old Chinese adage that the middle of the road is where you get hit by oncoming traffic.
I'd like to take that a little further also to ask about specifically the Israel issue, Rabbi Adlerstein, simply because, and despite your protests to the contrary, there is the element of Ramat Beit Shemesh, which is in Israel, and I do carry an Israeli passport. Perhaps I therefore have a very Israeli-centric way of looking at some of these issues. And maybe this is unfair to American Orthodox Jews or American Jews in general. There's a part of me that feels that, let's even assume that everything that Rabbi Kelsen said about Charlie Kirk's opinions are true and that Rabbi Willicke is incorrect. I'm not saying that. Let's even play this game, though, okay? I'd say, if he was the one who's acting as the vanguard, he's the one who's being pro-Israel, if he's the one who's moving more people into that camp, that is the single most important issue facing Orthodox Jews in the world today. The massive PR problem that Israel has, and the fact that so many people are feeling this anti-Israel / anti-Semitic, because they're often combined together, attitude towards Jews in Israel, that the other stuff, like you said, for example, regarding Nixon, it simply shouldn't be that important. We should be full-throated supporters of anyone who's willing to work with us, whether that person is someone we agree with politically across the board or someone who is pro-Israel and his other political positions we might find offensive or simply incorrect. Do you agree with that, or should we care about what his other positions are?
Both. Sorry for sounding rabbinic, but I agree entirely with the position that you've just staked out. But it's important then to act like Arabs do, to say one thing to the public, but not to allow that to become blind to where we should be feeling, where we should be emoting as Torah Jews. The famous vart of the Brisker Rav about why Eov was punished as one of the panel of three advising Paro what to do about the Jews after the first failed attempt and Paro's anger at someone who resisted, and Bilam went along with it wholeheartedly. So Yisro was the one who opposed him. What time do you have? What claim do you have against Eov for not speaking up when he saw that what happened to his predecessor and that it was going to meet with failure? So the Brisker Rav famously said, when something hurts, you scream. So we should be supporting politically Charlie Kirk, and we have to support the efforts of especially Rabbi Willicke, who may be the most important person now dealing with that camp. But it shouldn't allow us to believe everything that we're saying, and that we have to preserve some room for ourselves to know what the emes is.
Rabbi Willicke, what's your take on that, what Rabbi Adlerstein just said?
First of all, I appreciate the compliment that, if he meant it as a compliment, that I'm an important person dealing with that camp. It's a minefield. Believe it or not, it's not a role I always enjoy. In fact, it comes with a lot of difficulty. But look, I agree with that sentiment. And, what we're dealing with here is someone who, if I just kind of close the book on my thoughts on Charlie and the whole issue of Israel and how he related to us and how we should relate to him, is that he had issues with a progressive left-wing Jewish establishment that is very vocal and very powerful in America. He probably perceived it as more powerful than it actually is. But he was someone who was willing to say the quiet part out loud and point out something we all know is true, and that is that the vast majority of Jews in America and the Jewish establishment in America is supportive generally of progressive cultural positions, which means that the younger especially the younger part, but the Christian conservative political world is faced with a Jewish establishment that's on the opposite side of virtually every issue that they're fighting for. So when they're trying to bring more biblical awareness back into the classroom and have the Ten Commandments displayed in classrooms, or fight back against a trans culture which isn't about, let's be honest, it's not about the fact that individual adults choose to be a certain way. It's about the way this culture is actually being pushed in public schools. Orthodox Jews don't go to public schools. We're not bombarded with this the way they are. And they see the Jewish community, the established Jewish community, on the other side of these issues so much. And it creates some conflicts of interest for them. And it creates some, and it feeds on, it probably feeds on some negative things that are there, some negative sensitivities that are probably there anyway. But Charlie was someone who confronted these things. He talked about them openly. It didn't change the fact that he was supportive of Israel. But when he called out the left-wing Jewish establishment, the ADL on its website, it has a glossary of like problematic organizations and phrases and people, and it lists Turning Point USA as a potentially anti-Semitic organization, which is so absurd. And this would offend him, and this would get his back up. And he would speak out against the left-wing Jewish establishment, who would in turn call him an anti-Semite for calling them out. So it was kind of like this feedback loop, which painted certain positions that he held in ways that were untrue as to what they were. He was a person of tremendous integrity, but he was also a person who was not afraid to say things, even if they didn't have the nomenclature that everyone liked. Listen, it was complicated. I'll just close with echoing something Rabbi Adlerstein said at the very beginning of this conversation, which is that our main reaction to Charlie's death should be grave concern for what's going to happen now with the younger part of the American right, because Charlie was very much holding the line against a terrible wave that is pushing this younger generation further and further away from support for Israel. And some of these factors, like the left-wing Jewish establishment, feed into this unwittingly. And we should be very concerned about where that movement is going. I am trying to engage this movement, Rabbi Adlerstein, but it's a darker place now than it was before Charlie was killed.
Rabbi Wielicki, let me just follow up on that, because it's well known that you spoke to Charlie Kirk several hours before he was shot the night before to talk about Israel. And one of the lines that some on the farther right, people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, have been promulgating is that he was being pushed by the existing Jewish establishment to be more pro-Israel or not to be less pro-Israel. And according to this theory, he was moving in a direction away from Israel, turning a bit anti-Israel, but he was forced to stay in that space because of financial considerations and the threat of withdrawing significant financial support. Could you just respond to this oft-cited theory that they have that Charlie was, of course, it leads to the ridiculous notion that, that's why Israel had him killed. Obviously, that's absurd. But they're saying it came from the fact that he wasn't really pro-Israel. It was forced to be pro-Israel because of financial issues. Could you just talk about that and set the record straight if it needs to be set straight?
Yeah, Charlie was pro-Israel because he was an evangelical Christian. I encourage anyone to go find the video released by Pastor Rob McCoy, who was Charlie's personal pastor. They also traveled together. Whenever Charlie would travel overseas, he would go with Rob, and Rob is someone I know well, and you should listen to that. Where Rob talks about Charlie's views on Israel. He released it last week. Charlie called that meeting that I was in, and that meeting was called because it was the night before he was starting his next campus tour. Utah was the first stop on his tour, and because he was asked so many questions about Israel on all these campus tours, upwards of 40 or 50% of all the questions he would be asked would be attacks on Israel, and Charlie would be in a position of defending Israel, which he would do. It drove him nuts because he wanted to be talking about America and American issues, and he always found himself having to talk about Israel because he was asked about it, and he didn't even know the issues that well, which is where my whole relationship with him really began, was that he was looking for someone who understood MAGA politics and could understand his language, where he was coming from politically, but also was rooted in Israel, based in Israel, and knows the Israeli issues, so he could bounce things off in a confidential, safe way where he knows that what is shared between us would not get out in public. So that was the whole context of my relationship. And the purpose of this call was to go over Israel issues so that he had accurate information. And it doesn't mean that I gave him his talking points. He wasn't going to accept my positions necessarily. But he wanted to make sure that he had accurate information and that he could formulate positions that he was comfortable taking on the issues that relate to Israel. So the whole fact that he called this meeting gives lie to this claim that he had turned on Israel. Why would he have a meeting with Pesach Walicki to talk about Israel issues so that he could better defend Israel against the attacks that he knew were coming if he had turned on Israel? And if you listen carefully to Charlie's criticisms of Israel, and even in the context of platforming Tucker Carlson and others who are problematic, his real issue was with being called an anti-Semite for giving the platform to people who are anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. And that was, if there's any blind spot Charlie had, it was that to him, the airing all opinions and not canceling any voice was a higher value to him than when people like myself, and I did, would say to him point blank, look, Tucker Carlson's an anti-Semite, meaning that he just did not accept that. He didn't accept that. But it didn't change the fact that he was pro-Israel. He wasn't a fan of Prime Minister Netanyahu. He had criticisms like a lot of Jews do for Israel, and this is also something he resented. And when he would criticize Israel or criticize AIPAC or criticize the ADL, he would get called an anti-Semite. And he wasn't an anti-Semite. I criticize AIPAC and I criticize the ADL all the time. And that was really where he was coming from. It was complicated. It was, people have a hard time with nuance. They want him either to be, he's totally pro-Israel or he's turned on Israel. And it was a mixed bag, like all of us are.
Rabbi Kelsen, I'd still like to hear what you have to say about my earlier question to Rabbi Adlerstein about should advocating for Israel override all other issues for the most part, such that lionizing someone like Charlie Kirk is a worthwhile thing to do, even if we believe that some of his other positions are not in line with Torah values, because that is what matters at the current moment.
I think that there's definitely reason to call out and to say that somebody who stood up for Israel has been lost, to point out the challenges that, as Rabbi Wolicki has pointed out, the challenges that Rabbi Adlerstein has pointed out so eloquently, the challenges that he faced within his own world in supporting Israel, and point to somebody who went perhaps against, I don't know if it's the right terminology, perhaps, but went against his own interests or against the flow of his own community, so to speak, to support Israel, and that is definitely something that should be pointed out. And we should definitely show Hakar Satov for that. Hakar Satov is a halachic principle. It's not just something that our mother taught us to do, but it is a halachic principle. And I think that's something that we should definitely be doing. My only comment with that, caveat with that, is that, as I think you alluded to before, is that I think that we have to sort of understand where the limits are, and that to compare him to Avram Avinu is, sort of going over the line a little bit. So I have no problem with saying that somebody saying that that we lost somebody who was an ally of Israel, a staunch ally of Israel, and that this is a horrible thing that's happened. And, Rahman al-Islam to the world that it's gotten to such a point, and leaving it at that. I don't know that we need to highlight anything that was controversial. I don't know that we need to point out any of those things, but I also don't know that we need to go to to go out onto the limits, the levels that we've seen some parts of the community go.
Okay, I'd like to ask a final question because we don't have that much time, but I'd like each of you to talk about your feeling in terms of Orthodox reactions to things like Charlie Kirk's death. And in particular, the issue I want to talk about is there's an element, I think, which we've been alluding to, which is that there's this time when Orthodox institutions and organizations tend to line up. Maybe I'm incorrect in saying this, I don't live there, but sometimes it seems to me that there are those who consider themselves essentially as part of the Republican Party or the MAGA movement, almost as if the ideals espoused by MAGA or Republicans are equivalent to Torah values, and they're inseparable. Now, some people might say that's true. The problem is that other people who are also Torah Jews will say that's very much not true. The question really is it right for a rabbi or somebody else to preach from the pulpit about matters that are partisan? Meaning, if someone gets up there and talks about the righteousness of Charlie Kirk, on the one hand, someone might say, this is a very important message, and the ideals that he espoused are, at least in large part, something that we should admire and emulate. And someone else might say, that's not true at all. And a third person might say, even if it is true, we're risking alienating those who disagree. The question really is, at what point should somebody get up there and say this is no longer for shul, as opposed to this is exactly what we need to talk about in shul, and if we don't talk about it in shul, what else could we possibly talk about? What could be more important? Rabbi Adlerstein, let me start with you.
Yeah, that's sort of like a binary question. Is it one or is it the other? And if I have to answer in a binary way, yeah, I'm one of those who believe that rabbis should not discuss politics from the pulpit. It always leads to fragmentation and to divisiveness within the community. There are other fora for doing it. People can write, people can do podcasts, but the pulpit is not a place where it should be taking place. Let it take place over the herring in the Kiddush afterwards. At the same time, there are aspects that can avoid getting into the weeds of particular political positions that are still Torah lessons that could be learned. If you ask me what the takeaway from this whole thing is, I think we have a much greater understanding of the whole parsha of Charlie and where he was coming from and where things are going. I would say if there's any takeaway to dispel a little bit of the gloom, perhaps, of where things are going in the future, it should be that we should be the Charlie Kirks, as it were, b'ze'er anpin. Charlie was one who had the respect of literally of millions of people. The rest of us don't. So it's easy to say, hey, that's it's a curiosity, but it's not me. But the truth is that there are all these right-leaning Americans, many of them serious Christians, who need to be reassured by their Orthodox neighbors and co-workers. I firmly believe that pulpit rabbis should be not speaking from the pulpit, but should be reaching out to evangelical pastors in their communities. They don't have to be in walking distance on Shabbos for it. And in that way, in a small manner, be the Charlie Kirks who are trying to create a little bit of illumination, light, and sanity among those a segment of the community that traditionally has supported us.
I think I agree with Rabbi Adlerstein. I don't think that it is appropriate or wise for Rabbanim to discuss politics from the pulpit. I think especially, at least from what I've seen, when Rabbanim very often do not have a full grasp. Many Rabbanim, especially when they're Rosh Yeshiva and their Rabbanim and their attentions are are not necessarily focused on the breadth of what's going on. And so therefore they may very often miss a lot. And so therefore there is a tendency to rely on whatever the sources that they have for news, which very often are going to end up being a bias in one direction or another, which is not helpful. Just not a helpful approach for the tzibur, for those who rely on the rabbanim for responses, for answers, for understandings. And it doesn't help the Rav themselves either, because if they're speaking on something where they're not necessarily as well versed as they might be on a halachic matter, then it doesn't put them in a good position. And again, it also leads to machlokas within a community that doesn't necessarily have to be, or in certain instances, such as what you and I've discussed, and I've discussed with Rabbi Adlerstein, Rabbi Wilkie, and I have never actually had the opportunity to discuss together, where people such as myself end up becoming targets for some very unfortunate situations based on opinions or based on things that they've written because of what is being perceived from one side, one way or the other. And so I think that it's much better for Rabbanim, unless they're an absolute expert in the field, to stay out of these types of things.
Well, I'm not a community rabbi, so it's a little bit, I'm a little bit disconnected from some of these concerns. But I think what Rabbi Kelsen is raising here is really it speaks to a sad situation, which is that on the one hand, the people in Orthodox communities, members of communities, do look for their rabbis to be leaders and to guide them, and the Torah and Torah has what to say about politics. There's a lot of politics in Torah. And politics is about how we run the world, and the Torah is about how we run the world. And if rabbis are not knowledgeable enough to have an opinion, I see two problems here. Number one, if rabbis are not knowledgeable enough to have an opinion, then fine, they know Yeridea and they can teach Parshat Shavua, and they know how to look things up when people ask them shilas, which is what we call psak really just is. But if they don't know enough about current events to have an opinion, I don't know how they're supposed to guide their people. And maybe we have a dearth of leadership, and that people's sense of what the role of a rabbi is impoverished at this point. Because we do need to be able to have rabbis who can give some clarity of their political positions. At the same time, there's another problem, which is that because rabbis expressing their opinions has come to be equated in many people's minds as a claim that this is what the Torah position is, because that's the way rabbis tend to present their opinions. And if in the minds of people in the community, they feel threatened when a rabbi expresses a political opinion because it's as though the rabbi is saying that this is the Torah position. So that's also a problem. It means that our discourse is broken. But I don't see it as a lechatchila situation that rabbis should not be talking politics. All it means is that maybe out of necessity, maybe out of best practices in the current state of their ignorance of the issues, it happens to be the best practice, but that's b'di'evet. Ideally, rabbis should be able to be giving guidance on the most important issues of the day, which often are political. I'll just one comment also about what Rabbi Adlerstein said about reaching out, rabbis reaching out to pastors. One stereotype of the Jewish community, especially the Orthodox community, which I believe is like many stereotypes, is rooted in a whole lot of truth, is that Jews don't really care about anything unless it affects them, and they only care about it in as much and around whether or not it affects them. So, for example, I've been raising the alarm in articles that I've written and in speeches that I've given in Jewish communities for years about the problem of the persecution of Christians all over the world. And I believe that Jews have an obligation to speak out for this, just like we'd speak out for anyone who's being persecuted. And when we spend our whole lives saying, oh, the world was silent while Jews were being killed in the Holocaust. Okay, where are we when the most persecuted group in the world today by far is over 300 million Christians who are being persecuted mostly by Muslims in many different countries in the world? And why does the Jewish community not speak out for the persecution of Christians, as an example? But there is a stereotype, well-founded stereotype, that Jews don't really care all that much about something unless or only in as much as it affects them. And I think it's time for us to break out of that. And one good way to do that is at a time of crisis like this, for rabbis to reach out to pastors, as Rabbi Adlerstein said, and show some concern, and not only because it might benefit us in some way. That's exactly the point.
There's a lot more to say, but we have to stop right now, and I appreciate you all joining me today. Rabbi Pesach Ulicki, Rabbi Ben Kelsen, and Rabbi Yitzchak Adlerstein, I appreciate it. Before we sign off, a brief word of thanks. Several new listeners have joined our Patreon, and I'm genuinely grateful. You're not buying bonus episodes. You're underwriting the work, the research, editing, and the independence that lets us ask hard questions with respect and clarity. If today's conversation helped you think more carefully about Torah, community, and the world we inhabit, please consider becoming a patron. Even a small monthly contribution makes a real difference in keeping the Orthodox Conundrum going and accessible to everyone. The link is in the show notes. To those who have already joined, thank you. Your vote of confidence means more than you know. And to everyone else, I hope you'll consider joining us. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review The Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.